Hello everyone of discontent. My name is Aidan Conway and I will introduce our guests shortly. But before I do that, I want to just say a couple of words on behalf of the main event sponsor, SaskForward, and also say a couple of words of thanks to those who, in addition to our guests, have made tonight possible. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, SaskForward came together in late 2016 in response to the provincial government's announcement that following the end of the oil boom and mounting deficits, it would embark on a process of, quote, transformational change in healthcare, education, transportation, and other public services. Seeing the writing on the wall, we conducted a province-wide consultation in 2017 to offer the people of Saskatchewan the opportunity to respond to the government's agenda in the lead up to the 2017 budget. And we asked people to answer the question, what changes would you make to Saskatchewan to make it a happier, healthier, and more prosperous place for all? Shockingly, the government didn't heed our call for an alternative to short-sighted austerity, one we thought should be focused on protecting public services and forging a progressive direction for the province's future. Although it should be said that in response to some important mobilizations and public pushback, they did have to abandon some planks of their regressive agenda. In the intervening years, we've continued to try to promote critical, non-partisan, but unapologetically progressive alternative analysis, policy, and vision. Last fall, we co-hosted a Just Transition Summit that brought together Indigenous activists, educators, farmers, labor unions, and others to talk about how to build Saskatchewan's next economy and how to keep social justice at the center of the discussion about climate change and transition. If you're interested in learning more about SaskForward, please visit saskforward.ca or like and follow us on Facebook. Having got my gratuitous plug in, we can turn to the main event. Before I introduce our guests, I want to thank the Saskatchewan Government Employees Union who donated the sound equipment that we're using tonight. And I'd also like to thank Ron Brandt, who agreed to film the launch so that we can make it available to a wider audience at another date. It does take some money to do what SaskForward does, including putting on events like this. So we will be passing the hat or the bowl. And I encourage you to consider making a small donation to help defray the costs. Or large. So thank you for bearing with me through all of that. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our author and critic for tonight's launch. Martin Lukacs is the author of the Trudeau Formula. He is an investigative journalist who has covered Canadian politics for more than a decade. He's been an environmental writer for The Guardian and was a co-author of the LEAP Manifesto, and he lives in Montreal. Welcome, Martin. Jeet Heer is a national affairs correspondent at The Nation and the author of In Love with Art, Françoise Mouly's Adventures in Comics with Art Spiegelman, and Sweet Lechery, Reviews, Essays, and Profiles. And I want to mention that it may be a little known fact that Jeet, despite being a journalist and commentator with a national profile in both the United States and Canada, is a resident of Regina. And I have to admit that when I've spotted him with his children at the local playground, I've thought about how we could be taking better advantage of his presence here, and I'm glad we're able to do that tonight on the occasion of Martin's book tour. So Martin is going to provide a brief introduction to his book, and then he and Jeet will duke it out until they have everything figured out, or for about an hour, whichever comes first. I am not going to referee the conversation unless things get really out of hand, so you're on your own, Martin. Or if there is an awkward silence lasting more than 30 seconds. We do want to have some time for brief questions afterwards, and of course, we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to buy the book, have it signed if they wish, and say hello to Martin and Jeet. So please join me in giving a warm Saskatchewan welcome to Martin and also to Jeet.
Thanks for that intro, Aidan, and thanks so much to Emily and Simon for putting this on, and to SaskForward and everyone else who's involved in tonight's event. And thanks, Jeet, for coming. Definitely, it's usually a coup of my Saskatchewan visits to pull Jeet out and give the left a chance to see him. He's internet famous, and on a regular basis, international readers of his Twitter essays and writings at New Republic and now The Nation get to appreciate him. But definitely, I think he's appreciated here in Canada. And I think you've actually been a real tremendous support in my writing.
Actually, I should say that it's a bit awkward to be a critic here, since I've known Martin, even though he's very young, I've known him for a very long time, because I went to grad school with his mother, and so I've known him since he was an adolescent.
Jeet got me my first journalism interview. I don't know if you remember. It was after my first year of writing at the McGill University newspaper, and you got me an interview with this magazine.
Oh yeah.
For an internship, but I didn't really have much professional acumen back then. So during the interview, they asked me at the end of it, "Do you want to be a journalist when you get older?" And I was like, "No, not really." And it goes without saying that I didn't get the job. But I really appreciated that gesture. And I think you even encouraged me to write a book.
Yes,
but
I did.
6 or 7 years way too early for it to possibly pull it off. So thanks for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah, I'm definitely trying to disarm any kind of critique that he might have of the book by pandering to him now. What can I say about the book? Well, thank you all for coming. People have been saying that the book has great timing, but really it's only because I was just barely able to finish it then. When I started the book, or started thinking about the book a year and a half or 2 years ago, it felt very different to critique Trudeau. He, at the time, it felt like telling a friend who's swooning over the new hunky guy, he's got great abs, he even has emotional intelligence, but he's got some major neoliberal problems. Try telling that to someone whose ex-boyfriend is Stephen Harper. And when the next door neighbor is a leering, grotesque Donald Trump. And not to mention that Justin Trudeau made his literal campaign slogan that perennial male pledge, real change. Honey, this time I can really change.
And also, as you remind us in the book, in 2015, the Liberals under Trudeau ran to the left of the NDP, promising deficit spending to overcome austerity, and the NDP actually ran an austerity campaign.
Exactly.
After the worst recession since the 1930s.
Yeah, tax hikes on the 1%. Democratic reform across the board. A big part of his pickup lines was there's gonna be big, bold, transformative change.
Yes.
Of course, that's not what we got. Far from it. But he certainly offered initially the sensation of that, which, if we know the Liberal history, they have, not just his father, but including his father, have repeated that move when it comes to the Canadian public for more than 100 years, really. I guess one of the main propulsions to write the book was I actually wrote a column about Trudeau, comparing him very unfavorably to Jeremy Corbyn about 2 years ago, and kind of the creme de la creme of liberal intelligentsia in Canada had this epic meltdown on Twitter. Stephen Marsh, who's a writer for GQ, Esquire, Walrus, I think he called it a work of staggering stupidity and willful blindness. And Emmett McFarlane, who's a legal scholar and also kind of Twitter famous, called it a flaming garbage can, or trash can of an article. And then Gerald Butts too, who you'd think would be busy running the country. He took time off to call me ridiculous on Twitter. So I thought to myself, okay, if this is the reaction to an article, what happens if I write a whole book? But it also was revealing to me the whole episode was revealing because I, in that article, was really just juxtaposing the progressive claims of Trudeau and what they were in reality doing. And I think that got to the kind of like kryptonite of the Liberal Party, which is this attachment they have and this, long time compelling presentation as the progressive force for social change in this country. And my take is that they're not and never have been. But I was really curious to figure out how it is that they pull that off. And so in the book, I try to kind of try to observe the Liberal Party and its policymakers, its power brokers in their like natural habitat. So, the conferences and the think tank confabs and, the weapons trade shows, the Public-Private Partnership Association conference meetings, and kind of see how they talk to one another, and especially how they talk to the corporate elite when no one else is in the room, or when they think no one else is in the room. Sometimes there's lefty journalists who are flies on the wall. And my sense is that picture that emerges is radically different from what most Canadians learn, certainly in the reflection that we see of the Liberal Party in the mainstream media.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good place to maybe start sort of the questioning, because I do feel like that is the most original and useful part of the book. I think like obviously to record the stuff that Trudeau promised and then has not lived up to is a very useful exercise. But I think what gives the book a kind of like a theoretical edge is that it places Trudeau in the context of the Liberal Party. And the Liberal Party is a kind of very curious formation, straddling the kind of political spectrum of the center, but also absorbing a lot of progressive energy. And I think you're right that this is like a sort of like a long run thing. I think one way of maybe thinking about the Liberal Party is the sort of the classical analysis of imperialism, that scholars often talk about parties being sort of comprador parties. These are parties that exist to sort of mediate between popular agitation at a local level and sort of the demands of transnational capital, and to try to work out some sort of deal that can keep both parties happy. But how do you see the Liberal Party?
Yeah, one of the metaphors I use in the book is that the Liberal Party operates as a kind of like shock absorber for the establishment. They are able to kind of like absorb, often selectively and very carefully and cannily, the discontent and anger towards the elite, and then sometimes make some small concessions, and sometimes absorb the layers of elite leadership. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, they serve to preserve the prevailing power structure. So there's one quote from a 19th century Italian novel by Lampedusa. It's the book's The Leopard. And I find it a kind of perfect distillation of the liberal approach. And so basically it's 19th century Italy, which is undergoing upheaval. And Tancredi, the aristocratic protagonist of the novel, is conferring with the members of his besieged class. And he understands better than they do that something has to give. And he tells them, if we want things to remain the same, things will have to change. If we want things to remain the same, things will have to change. And that to me is a kind of perfect distillation of how the Liberal government, especially under Trudeau, operates. Trudeau is this like, at least initially, obviously things are unraveling for him in terms of his brand, but initially was this kind of dazzling simulation of defiance, this kind of woke politician from the future. And he provided people this, much like his father in some ways, this sense that he was leading the charge into a new political age. I think
that's right. I think that's, I think this is actually something that the kind of left in particular has to kind of grapple with, though, the power of the Liberal Party and the way it has consistently co-opted select elements of the left agenda. I mean, going back to certainly Mackenzie King and the sort of welfare state reforms that were introduced as a way to defeat the CCF, and so it is a very powerful political formation. With how long have they been in power? Like in Canada,
I think it's like 80. They've been in power 85 of the last 120 years. So they are the most successful Liberal Party in the world.
And I think probably either the most successful or the second most successful political party in any democracy. The only other comparison is the Conservative Party in England, I think
the master of all arcane political trivia. If you know his Twitter essays.
But I think, but even the Conservatives. I mean, but in England, it's a sort of instructive difference, though, because the differences between the two parties are sharper. When Labour does win, not under Blair, but under previously, it does make sort of fundamental transformational change. Whereas in Canada, we have a party that is comparable, I guess, to the Liberal Democrats or a lot of the European parties of the sort of center left, but which is much more powerful than those parties, and much more powerful, I actually think, than the Democrats in the United States, which is a comparable party.
Yeah, I mean, not to get too ahead of ourselves, but definitely the long-term goal, I think, would be to consign the Liberal Party in this country to its natural spot, like the Liberal Democrats in the UK, which is a marginal force, befitting what they actually represent, which is, in my view, in terms of their natural allegiances, not a very great deal of Canadians. But somehow they've been able to, as you say, kind of sit astride a far larger political constituent, and electorate than they deserve. And to me, it's in some ways admirable. Maybe I just have Stockholm syndrome from spending too much time thinking about Justin Trudeau, but I think it is admirable the way in which they've practiced that manufacturing of consent or hegemony, or however you might call it, their ability to persuade people that their politics are commonsensical and naturally aligned with where Canadians are at.
I know it's a very. I feel like it's a very nimble party. Like it has a kind of ability. I mean, there's obviously periods where it's out of power, but it does seem to consistently reinvent itself, and there is perhaps a lesson in that.
Well, the nimbleness. I mean, I start the first chapter, with what I think is probably the most unvarnished speech that Trudeau gives in terms of his actual intentions, that he gives to basically the ritziest speaker series of Bay Street, the Canadian Club of Toronto. And it's quite deft. I mean, he turns up at this place, and it's just a few days after the Liberals announced this policy of taxing the 1%, which is the very audience he's speaking to. And most of the corporate media has been bleating about how dare the Liberals engage in class warfare, and redistributionist dogma is not going to serve Trudeau. But the thing is that's what we expect from the National Post and the Globe and Mail, who I think actually aren't that crafty class war practitioners.
They're less nimble than the Liberal Party.
They're much less nimble, and then the Liberal Party actually gets what's going on. That actually redistributionist dogma, or playing at it, is actually what is going to play really well. Yeah. And he basically tells these, the billionaire class in Bay Street that if it's either me or the pitchforks. He says, if we don't usher in social change, if we don't deal with the status quo, which he says is unsustainable, then he says, quote, Canadians are ready to entertain more radical options. And that's a pretty canny reading of the political temperature in this country.
Yes,
in many ways, much more canny and lucid than where the NDP is, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think this is one of the things that is very valuable with the book, that you kind of respect the people that you're writing about, even if you don't agree with them, and they are very smart people. I should mention, by way of gossip, I was once in a reading group with Jerry Butts.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, tell us more.
Well, he did the readings. No, he did the readings, and he's. I mean, like, you know, he's a smart guy, very very quick on his feet. I do remember I mean,
tell us the year. Tell us the.
This was like
paint a scene for us.
This was like before he started to work for the
WWF.
Yeah, before McGuinty. So this was like
late 90s.
Yeah, late 90s. Yeah, early 2000.
He was a student of Hegel.
Yeah. He was a student of Hegel, and I think that's how he got into the group, because there was a bunch of sort of people. He was in Toronto, but there was a bunch of people who were from Dalhousie, who you must have, who were Hegelians, and and he did talk about Hegel a lot, even though it was a reading group devoted to Joyce's Ulysses. But he would bring in Hegel, I think quite inappropriately, by the way.
Unfortunately, clearly he didn't like Butts didn't make the natural leap to Marx, because then we might have had his skills on our side.
That's right, yeah. But no, I mean, he is actually very, I do remember, he is interested in sort of like class issues, and he was very quick to pick up on Piketty. But that came later. One more. But he's also very interested in people, in the way politicians often are, in people's weaknesses or gossips. And so there's like one of our members of our reading group was a kind of sort of shy guy who didn't seem interested in women, and he did kind of like gossip and speculate unwarrantedly, and I think very. I don't want to say too much bad things about him, but I thought in the wrong way. You know,
don't worry, we're not on camera or anything.
The guy's sexual orientation, which I thought was totally inappropriate, but I thought it was sort of coming not quite from a place of homophobia, but maybe a place of like, you know, he likes to figure out, you know, what people are and what can be used against them. Yeah. Anyways, that's my Jerry Butts story.
I mean, there's another interesting association that you have. You reviewed Justin Trudeau's memoir for the Globe and Mail.
Yes.
And you yourself were so generous, and that I think a blurb from that review ended up on the front cover of all subsequent reeditions of Justin Trudeau's memoir.
Oh dear, that's. Yeah. I was a little bit too generous, and partially the reason I was generous was that John Kay had co-written it, and I think he had blamed me for getting him fired from the Walrus, and so I felt like I shouldn't be too harsh about this book from a guy who.
This is the good gossip we're getting now.
Yeah, but no, I think Kay did a decent job of ghostwriting.
Not only that, I'm sure some people on the left are not going to like me for saying this, but. I think Kay actually has written the most insightful personal profile of Justin Trudeau.
Yes.
Like I don't get much into the biography of Justin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more interested in him as a kind of avatar, as a like I write that if he didn't exist, the most canny among the corporate elite would have tried to invent him. Mm-hmm. So to me,
well, in a way, Jerry Butts did invent him. I mean,
in some ways, yes, that's true. But I lost my train of thought.
Oh, you're talking about John Kay's profile.
Oh, John Kay. Yeah, he wrote a really revealing thing about him, because I think he spent some time with him.
Yes.
And his sense was that, you know, he comes from a broken family.
Mm-hmm.
His mom left very young, and Justin has like a deep need to be loved. And in many ways, that has. I mean, of course, everyone does, but in I hear everything, Trio. But in a way, it's kind of it made him perfect material for the kind of figure he became, which was, you know, everyone could project their aspirations onto him, you know, and that fit this liberal communication strategy, not just with Trudeau, but it dates way back. Like there's this line from Marx, not Karl, Groucho, which I think is a perfect summation of this approach, which is Groucho says, "Here are my principles. Oh, well, if you don't like them, I have others."
Yeah. No, it also fits in with his kind of theatricality and the fact that he's Canada's foremost minstrel show aficionado. I mean, you know, like he likes dressing up, and he likes, in a kind of almost innocent way, you know, like taking on other identities. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it does speak to kind of the vacancy. But I mean, I think it is this sort of strength of the book that it doesn't focus on these personal personal things, but it is interesting. That is the ideal clay that you would want if you're a Jerry Butts or one of these other Liberal Party insiders to, form. But I mean, what do you think is the agenda of the Liberal Party? Like, is it just to power for the sake of power? Does it have any larger sense of mission, or is it like, you don't like these principles, we have others?
I mean, honestly, I have tried to understand what their political ambitions and goals are, apart from being as proximate and as useful to power as possible. And it's hard to discern it, right? It's hard to discern it from certainly what this government has done the last 4 years. I mean, when you scratch at basically any single one of their policies, you find them evacuated of any substantial progressive meaning, right? Yeah. And they, in many ways, they have this uncanny ability to channel whatever corporate priority or policy there is and somehow transform it into a vehicle for progressive change, or to make people think that's the vehicle for progressive change. So I mean, I do a little bit of a kind of genealogy of the carbon tax in Canada, which is presented to us in the mainstream media as the litmus test for climate action bravery, right? With the Liberals on one side being the adults in the room, and then you have like the climate Neanderthals or nihilists or whatever their preferences for the day among the Conservatives. But I discovered that, from about 2006 onward, the main business lobby in this country, the Business Council of Canada, who have had a very close relationship with the Liberal Party since their formation in the early 70s, they were the ones who were like, look, Canadians are definitely getting riled up about big oil. They have deep concern about the environmental crisis. They want some kind of action, and let's give them the carbon tax. There was this business prof whose book I looked into, and she had done interviews with all the leading industry execs in 2007, 2008, and there was this astonishing consensus. Everyone wanted the carbon tax. But the problem is they ran into Stephen Harper. And Stephen Harper was like, anything associated with taxes? No way. So they kind of bid this corporate elite kind of bid their time until, Jerry Butts and Justin Trudeau came to them saying, look, we'll do exactly that. We don't actually have any substantial differences with Harper when it comes to actually, developing the tar sands. We're just concerned that they haven't really done a good job marketing it. Yeah. And then that's what we get. We get carbon tax as a green fig leaf for massive developments in the oil sands. But somehow they've managed to convince us that that's the preference of progressive Canadians. So I find that remarkable, truly remarkable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how much is it their own success, or how much of it is due to the fact that the political situation is already spectrum is presented as the choices between them and the Conservatives? It's like, Trudeau or Harper, or Trudeau or Scheer. Is it so much that the Liberals are good at selling this, or is it that there's a...
I think they construct it. I mean, no doubt that the corporate media is, of course, ready to write the NDP out of the picture entirely. We've certainly seen that in this election. The NDP has probably the most progressive platform in a generation, and yet, they have for the first time in who knows how long, especially since, under Mulcair, he swore off against taxes. I think he called any taxes above their current rates confiscatory, and of course, praised Margaret Thatcher to the roof. But this time around, they're kind of channeling the Green New Deal a little bit, but they're being completely, of course, written off out of the picture by the corporate media. So it's true that there is this symbiosis between the establishment media and the party, but I think they go a long way towards constructing that. All the way back to Mackenzie King. Yeah. I quote Mackenzie King in the book talking to Winston Churchill about how he was like, "There's no way I'm going to let the CCF steal the political oxygen, steal the left vote," right? And that's been just this constant current and theme in liberal politics. And Butts is just the latest practitioner of that
Yeah.
maneuvering.
Yeah, and how much is it? I mean, we were talking about sort of Trudeau, this sort of facade politics, this sort of Potemkin politics, like.
But I think Ford. I mean, say a bit more about why you think people like Ford are exemplars of that as well.
Well, I think that a lot of it is a sort of like a politics of where what you're selling is not actually even policy, it's attitude, right? And for like the people on the right, someone like Trump or Ford, the appeal isn't so much what they're doing. It's just like they're pissing off the right people. They're pissing off the urban elites, and they're in your face. And so I feel like it's like there's people. Both politicians are kind of like selling a sort of dream or aspiration. Like one is a kind of aspiration for a sort of lovey-dovey unity and harmony, and another is an aspiration for like in your face revenge.
Yeah, I wonder if that's giving enough credit to the kind of faux populism of the right, though, because I think what they're also doing is, in this country, is effectively channeling a lot of the anger that exists towards the elite. I mean, of course, they're channeling it towards scapegoating of migrants or indigenous peoples, people of color in Alberta, foreign-funded radicals. But I think that the liberals were doing it to the extent that they could without totally pissing off their constituency and the corporate elite. The Tories were doing it even more, and my frustration is that the left is not doing it. Like that great slogan from the UK, Jeremy Corbyn's "For the many, not the few," has been picked up in Canada, but it's not been picked up by the left. It's been picked up by the right and the center. So the group that has used that slogan is Ontario Proud, which is probably the most successful online social media group, and by like North 99, which is this kind of liberal social media front group. But they're clearly tapping into. They're reading the temperature.
Well, actually, do you want to? I mean, this is a little bit outside the book, but maybe sort of it's very much related to it, which is to what degree does that sort of the fake woke liberalism of Trudeau create precisely this opportunity for the right to cast itself as a true populace?
Well, I think one aspect of it is that their policies don't actually address the pain and insecurity and grievances in this country. Like in this country, we have two billionaires, two men who own as much wealth as the bottom 30% of Canadians. And people know in their bones that they are getting fleeced by a hoarding class, right? That is even in some ways more narrow and more insular and more family-based than it is in the United States. People are pissed. Like there was this poll done by a pollster who is closely read by the Liberal Party, just in 2014, which asked Canadians if they agreed with the following statement: if wealth continues to concentrate at the very top and wages stagnate for everyone else, I expect to see violent class conflicts emerge. And 2 out of 3 Canadians agreed with that. So people are pissed, rightly, I think. And often in the corporate media, they get reflected back to them this idea that populism is just this, this force of dark unreason that emanates either from the right, but then they often draw, a fake moral equivalence to the left as well. So I think that kind of politics from the Liberal government engenders a lot of political opportunities for the right, but also, of course, for the left, right? And it's just a question of seizing it. Like, I don't know if there's another poll, I read a lot of polls, clearly, but there was a poll by Forum Research just a few weeks ago, and it said that 60% of Canadians have a positive attitude towards socialism. I mean, that's like unheard. Unfortunately, Canadians are too polite because 60% of them also have a positive attitude towards capitalism. So there's something going on there that we need to.
Yeah, there's like 20% that are confused by that number.
We need to sort it out.
But
it's like I'm old enough to remember when socialism was like a dirty word that we would whisper in hushed tones at parties, right? And now it's like being embraced by millions of people in a confused way. Like young people are like putting it on their Tinder profiles. And we have like a shouty Jewish man who identifies as one who could very well be the next president of the United States of America. So there's huge opportunity in this country as well.
Yeah. The other aspect of the sort of Trudeau formula, or this liberal formula, I mean, you in the book you carry it through a bunch of different policies and areas, but one I wanted you to talk about a little bit, because I think it's very important, is with natives and this sort of, what you see as the sort of the fraudulence of the reconciliation process.
Yeah. Well, I describe it in the book. Increasingly, people are using this term, but I describe the politics of Justin Trudeau towards Indigenous peoples as the reconciliation industry, and I see the Trudeau governments and the Liberals shape-shifting generally on an issue by basis. They shape-shift more when dependent on the strength of the social movement around that issue. And of course, Idle No More had a very powerful and enduring impact on Canadian society, culturally and socially in particular. I think politically it didn't have any concrete gains, but obviously in the cultural landscape it's changed things completely. And I think the Liberal government, the Liberal Party initially was very attuned to that, and they made it the central part of their political program, that they would usher in a totally new era, and it was remarkable to see just how widespread the superficial changes were, right? So like there are bureaucrats now at the Ministry of Indian Affairs who are probably the first bureaucrats in Canadian history to casually use the term decolonization. And you walk into that place now and you smell the waft of sweetgrass from the smudges that happen in an elders lodge in the heart of the Department of Indian Affairs. And Trudeau, when as compared to someone like Harper, when young activists erected a teepee on Parliament Hill just before the 150th anniversary of Canada. Under Harper, like the security just would have been dispatched to dismantle it. But Trudeau, put on his jean jacket, which is what he always wears when he has to deal with a sensitive situation. And he went out there and he took the shoes off and he sat in circle with them and he took the feather then of course Jerry Butts took a photo of the thing and tweeted out that this is just one step in this long journey to decolonization, and they renamed institutions. So there was this whole show of this whole spectacle really of contrition and a transformation. But if anything, it was more a shapeshift than a sea change. And what we saw is that the policies fundamentally, when it came to land rights, were remarkably unchanged. If anything, Trudeau, with this kind of spectacle of contrition that has in many ways disguised their contemporary current policies, has managed to advance the fundamental agenda of dispossession of land rights far further than Harper was ever able to. He has, through opening the funding channels and through cultivating, the Liberals are very good at relationships. They cultivated very close relationships with many of the more establishment-friendly Indigenous leaders, turned on the funding channels, and have essentially managed to get a good majority of First Nations ensnared in these negotiations that have ultimately the end goal of then that very ugly word, legal word, extinguishment of land rights. And the ultimate end goal, which has been the end goal of the Ministry of Indian Affairs, who basically is directing this agenda regardless of the spectacle, is the same that it has been for 130 years, which is the assimilation of Indigenous peoples as nations, their consignment to postage stamp land bases, and self-government that is nothing more than the right of First Nations to basically administer their own poverty. And for a long time, I think that agenda was humming along really nicely. Trudeau was certainly in the international media, but also in the domestic media, there was barely a whimper of criticism. And then it was thanks to Indigenous resistance to their kind of marquee piece of legislation, the recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights, that first kind of put these chinks in their armor. And then, of course, what happened in the Northwest BC with the Unistoten blockade of a fracked gas pipeline is kind of what forced Trudeau's hand. And ultimately, when push comes to shove, the Liberal government, though they tried to avert this possibility, I think, ultimately dispatched the strong arm of the state. And then you kind of got to see the true face of the Liberal government. But I think probably on that issue they still have bamboozled most Canadians. You know, I think that there's been a huge. I mean, I remember even speaking to critics like Leanne Simpson, you know, who's a really fierce critic of the federal government and Canadian colonialism. I remember she told me, like, this was just at the outset of maybe the first year of his office, that she found it difficult to criticize him because people in her community were like, no, we should give this guy a chance. He's mouthing all the right words. So it was a really remarkable feat, I think, initially. And that's why, in part, I devote 45 pages of the book to it, because I think it also throws into relief that model of changeless change that they're so good at. Like, there was just like a frenzy of activity that they were involved in. There's an incredible stat that was put together by the Yellowhead Institute, which is this great new Indigenous rights think tank. And they tallied all the efforts and initiatives of the Liberal government, and they found that if all the Liberal government's bills and legal initiatives had passed, that would have represented 40% of legislation relating to Indigenous peoples passed since 1867. So there was a ton of activity, and it was a full-time job, and it is a full-time job for lots of Indigenous policy analysts just to keep track with everything that's being thrown at them. But ultimately, this this spectacle of disruption and upending of the status quo actually ends up just serving to entrench the prevailing disparities and inequalities. So it's quite a feat.
Okay. So I think I'll have like one last question, and we can go to the audience. And
I have a question for you.
Okay. Yeah.
If that's okay. I mean, following your writing for the last few years, I've been so struck by. So Jeet's at The Nation now, and for so long I thought of you as a kind of like erudite, like interpreter of the left from a liberalism, right?
Yeah.
But my sense is, in the same way that the Canadian public is kind of like a, left curious, they identify as left curious like liberals, like, could you serve as this, emblem of someone who has maybe shifted leftward over the last few years when pushed by social movements, or have you always been consistently there?
Yeah, no, I've always been, since, I'm trying to think, I think probably starting around like 1990 or 1991. I mean, for me, the first Gulf War is a big kind of radicalization moment, and I would sort of consistently think of myself as left. But I'm also older than a lot of people, and I think there's a very particular, there's sort of generations on the left, and so what you find on the left is that there's a lot of people that are like really old, like Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn, and there's a lot of people who are very young, and then there's this kind of like middle generation of people who became leftist in the 80s and 90s, which is the peak period of kind of neoliberalism. And so I think it's a more distinct or kind of like skeptical or left politics. So it's kind of very much aware of the traumatized, but aware of I just saw this tweet from Pete Buttigieg where he said like, neoliberalism is like this philosophy that governed for the last 40 years and has not worked, and and I thought like, wait a minute. Like, Pete Buttigieg is a neoliberal, first of all, and it's so weird to hear like a Democrat, centrist Democrat talking these terms. And so for me, it's like hard to wrap my head around, because my political formation was at the period where neoliberalism was like I say, like 1990, 91, with Clinton and Blair, it was probably the most successful ideology in the history of the world. Like there's never been an ideology that had that global scope, and where the only points of we're, to the extent that where one would think like even things like the Islamic fundamentalists were basically still part of that neoliberal. Like Bin Laden still wanted an Islamic capitalist state, but he didn't want like there was very little like real resistance out there, and so I think that might explain some of the ways and some of the reasons why I write about the left the way I do.
And it's interesting. I think the Canadian liberal part in constructing that kind of neoliberal hegemony gets short shrift, because I think in some ways when we tell that history of the third way, of the Clinton kind of Blair turn, Jean Chrétien never gets mentioned. But it's interesting. This is a chapter I didn't in the end include in the book because I needed to finish it and get it out before the elections. But I tried to trace some of that history of the Canadian Liberals' part in building that. And I talked to an advisor of Blair who told me that Jean Chrétien in some ways was considered like the godfather of the third way, someone who alongside Paul Martin had gone to work dismantling the state.
Well, and as with Clinton, like they had more successfully dismantled the sort of or pushed back against the gains of the 60s and 70s than any conservative was able to. And then Harper was able to later.
I mean, the most devastating neoliberal transformation of the state in Canada happened not under Mulroney, but under Chrétien and Martin. And that's been, I think, completely wiped away from our sense of history in this country.
But I mean, I think Chrétien might actually, in some ways, explain some of this kind of skill of the Liberal Party and how it exists. Because I feel like Chrétien is almost a classic. It's a sort of code switcher. Like he was able to, switch from sort of like a populist street language and very vernacular Quebecois French to the sort of like business talk, but also like kept enough aware of the public. Like I thought his decision not to go into the Iraq War, the second Iraq War, was kind of very significant. It shows the way in which the Liberal Party of Canada is precisely so nimble in a way that Blair was not, and Hillary Clinton was not. Like, so I do think that there's something about the way in which Canadian federalism produces very talented code switchers who are aware of the ways you can talk to different communities, and the Liberal Party has absorbed that talent. That maybe explains the sort of hegemony of liberalism in Canada. I think Canada is the liberal country par excellence, where the kind of liberal project has been most successful.
That's not a bad point to end on, except maybe to say that I think ultimately it is also quite brittle and fragile. Because this country has a enduringly and in some ways growing progressive majority. I mean, 60 to 70% of Canadians whose values are essentially social democratic, and yet that Liberal Party has managed so well to channel those people's aspirations and never fulfill them. But I think I like to think that their hold ultimately can be unwrenched.
Jeet, before Martin threw you the question about being a traumatized Gen X leftist, you said you had one last question. Is that something you want to pursue?
Well, why don't we throw it to the floor?
No, I think we go to the floor. I think our sort of I think the last bit took up a lot of the points I wanted to raise. Actually.
Does anyone have a question or a short comment? No speeches, please.
So, I have to preface this saying that I was probably one of only a few people that was actually surprised by Trudeau and Trudeau becoming, I'm an older-ish socialist. I'm not even a socialist, but lefty. But I recall after Misha's death, Misha was the original heir apparent. It was supposed to be Michelle. I'm starting to formulate a mediocre man theory of history now. following that, Trudeau Fils got a lot of press, and he sounded incredibly vacuous and tone deaf. His response to Misha's death was to found a charity devoted to educating people about backcountry skiing, which charity and backcountry skiing don't really go together in my mind. So the transformation into someone that you can project things onto came as kind of a surprise to me, because all throughout I found him, again, incredibly vacuous and tone deaf. Anyway, that's any comment. And any comment on the implications, what if Misha, because you, Jeet, have been observed, what if Misha had not had that, fallen into the lake, basically?
Well,
You handle that one.
well, no, I don't know. I don't know if we could say much speculating, like what if. But I mean, it is interesting. Like if you about the tone deafness, because I think that's also always been there, and there have been a couple of instances very early on. I think in response to the torture bill of the Conservatives, where he was like very, he kind of gave a lot of indications of the problems of with his politics, but people were able to put that all aside. And it's interesting, like that. I mean, because I think that tone deafness has always been there from the start.
It has. I also think that, maybe this is my Stockholm syndrome speaking again, but I think when he speaks off the cuff, when we see the real Justin, certainly there's the blackface stuff, but also to his credit, like that's when he says his most genuinely progressive things, like when he made that statement on Fidel Castro's death, right? And rightly lauded the certain achievements of the Cuban Revolution, or when, he ad-libbed while talking about the F-35, scandal of the Conservative government, and said, I think something like, what do the Conservatives want to do? Like take out their jets and wave them around and see who's the biggest? And it was like a sincerely, if awkwardly put, critique of patriarchal war. So. But yeah, I mean, he's certainly grown into a more talented politician, someone who's able to become that mask. And in some ways, he had pretty long training through his 30s. I talk about how he, before he became a politician, was a really successful speaker on the corporate circuit, right? He was like an advocate for environment, youth, and some such thing. And if you read, I watched a few of his speeches, and they are, they're vapid and vacuous, but in an artful way, right? So it's like you can literally find whatever you want in them, which is also like his book Common Ground, which I suffered through reading that thing. And there's literally nothing you can pin down, right? I mean, you can't really find any clear political philosophy or even any real principle apart from that he embraces the diversity of the country, and his opponents on the right and left are divisive, which is his favorite put down, as if this country would not, fundamentally divided in so many ways. So I think there's a kind of neoliberal artfulness to that style of oration that is fundamentally empty. And initially, I certainly had the same reaction as you, which is how do people groove with this guy? He's just clearly ridiculous. But it took quite some time to develop it, and it was successful for a time, right? Certainly for his election, and then of course, once the policies eclipsed to some degree the image, it was impossible to sustain. But which is also what happened with his father.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
It was all about the initial image. And I tell some stories in the book about how, literally they tread the same tracks in some ways, promises of, radical democracy within the party. And, their party spokespeople talk endlessly about it at the convention. And then you walk 3 doors down, and it's the Laurier Club Lounge, which I snuck into. And it's all the corporate lobbyists, throwing back champagne and beers with the MPs. That's where things actually happen. It's the farthest thing from radical democracy. But but successful for a time. So, and then I think what you saw from I'd be really interested to see how he starts to maneuver now if he wins in minority again, because what we saw with Pierre Elliott Trudeau is, of course, then later he was actually forced in a situation where the left or the NDP held the balance of power to actually make significant concessions, like we saw eventually with, Petro-Canada and the National Energy Program. I talk about in the book how that was, in many ways, the most significant, far-reaching intervention in the economy we've had in the last 50 years, with all its flaws. I think it's possible to push the Liberal Party in a way that you can't necessarily push the Conservatives.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The sort of periods of social economic progress in Canada have been precisely where the Liberals were most interested in co-opting or left energy, with like Mackenzie King and then Trudeau in the mid-70s.
I'm just going to raise a couple of points, like a look for, because it can go on forever. I've been tinkering around. This has to do with Judy Wilson-Raybould as Justice Minister, Attorney General. A few little information came out December 2018 over the detention of the Huawei executive, going from China, changing planes in Vancouver, then on to Buenos Aires. She was apprehended. The order to apprehend her came into Judy Wilson-Raybould. She red flagged it immediately to the Prime Minister's office, and she was apprehended. Then you got the other thing with SNC-Lavalin. There's something, I got hold of a Freedom of Information on the Trump Secretary of State, and I tried to find it to bring it here, and it basically says, and I don't know the date, but it's close in that 2018, and it says, it names Freeland, and the statement goes on, the Canadians are on side in supporting America first. So I'm just raising this whole thing about December 2018 and January 2019 and what was going on. And in there is racism, Judy, forget all the myths and stuff like that. There's class differences going on within the Indigenous people. She's one person as part of a comprador class and exists. Second point, look for. Financial Post is good, Globe and Mail is good. What you have taking place now as a bedrock of reconciliation, the third way, okay, is the comprador class wants access to capital and they're getting it. Big time. Trans Mountain, all resource agreements. The core of that, a good starting point, is the Fort McKay Band and Suncor. Brokered by the Royal Bank of Canada. This is all in the Globe and the Financial Post. The Royal Bank of Canada, and they're brokering Trans Mountain and other resource agreements. I'll just leave it at that.
No doubt. The story I tell is, I think, one that hasn't been told quite in this way, which is I see the whole SNC-Lavalin affair and Jody Wilson-Raybould taking a stand on that as intimately connected to how the struggle over the reconciliation legislation played out. And it's true, I think Jody Wilson-Raybould was in some ways the kind of crown jewel politically in the approach of the Trudeau government. I mean, she carried a lot of water for them politically. She was the one kind of dispatched to deliver harsh news. So, Trudeau went to the UN and declared that we would, implement the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. And then it was Jody who was the one sent to the AFN meeting to tell them, actually, the UN Declaration is impractical, unworkable, and it's not going to happen, guys. And what was interesting is that when the resistance to a piece of legislation that she in many ways had been the designer of through her work in the BC Treaty process and with the regional AFN, and had been basically for that reason scouted by Paul Martin, mentored by him, and then recruited by Justin. She was a really important role in manufacturing consent for this agenda. And when it started to fall apart, a lot of the Indigenous leadership who were part of this mainstream, who had been won over to that agenda, when they split with it in the fall of 2018, there was literally no high-profile Indigenous people left standing alongside Justin Trudeau except for her. And I think, though she's got a new book out, so I don't think she's going to address it in this way, but I think that one of the reasons she took a stand on SNC-Lavalin had a lot to do with rehabilitating her image in Indian country. The corporate media after the SNC-Lavalin affair broke in February of 2019, they kind of scoured her public remarks in the fall of 2008 and found many moments where she had started kind of criticizing the Liberal government. But the very first time she did, September 13th, was the day after, politically, Indigenous peoples had defeated that piece of legislation that she had been a key designer of. So I think that, and no one in the media kind of had figured this out, but I think it lines up. And so that story, I think, has not really been told. So I think Indigenous resistance to Trudeau's agenda in some ways is what ultimately provoked that standoff over SNC-Lavalin. And I think credit should be given. Though, yeah, ultimately she has gone through this kind of rehabilitation, and she's been romanticized and heroized. But rarely do people question, like, why would she have worked for the Liberal Party in the first place? So yeah, it's an interesting history. So it's in the reconciliation industry chapter. But I haven't, as to your thing about, the stuff you talk about happening abroad, I haven't heard of that. So I'd be welcome to look, I'd be curious to look at the material you've uncovered.
Quick sentence, I don't want to access to capital was big time started at Harvard. Trudeau's continuing.
No doubt. That buying off Indigenous communities, many of them are often incredibly poor, and so that has been a strategy certainly that didn't really start with Harper. It came from the corporate elite, and Harper picked it up, and Trudeau has taken it further, no doubt. I mean, the payoffs, the buy-offs have gotten bigger and bigger. I mean, communities like in Northwest BC fighting against LNG plants, in Laxwalam, refused initially an offer of like $1.2 billion. So it's true the payoffs are getting bigger, but the resistance also in protection of the sacred has also remained fierce, and it's not working. I think ultimately, it's true they are picking off some communities, especially in the Alberta region, and they've rebranded the pipeline as some of the pipeline proposals as like the reconciliation pipeline, which is the natural, like, logical conclusion of that agenda. But I don't think it's going to work because there are so many Indigenous communities in BC and elsewhere who are standing strong against that agenda.
Okay. Thank you both. You sort of outlined this kind of depressing clutch that the Liberal Party has had on the Canadian public, but I appreciate that you end with this kind of hopeful. It's brittle and fragile. So my question is, what do you think can pose a serious challenge to the Liberal Party? Is it the NDP? Is the NDP up to that task if they were to sort of, take a shift, a sea change, as you put it? Is it social movements in Canada, such as they are? Maybe you don't even want to, address this question because you're a journalist, not a political theorist, although you seem to be both.
I'm just an activist. Masquerading as a journalist.
Okay, awesome. So, and maybe you can both weigh in on this, or one of you. Thanks.
I don't think it's going to come from the NDP in its current state, but I think that if any party is going to be the vehicle for that, it would be the NDP. With it is the party with organic ties, though shriveled, to social movements and a social base and, ties in the labor movement. But I think it will only happen if they offer like a compelling, unapologetically bold agenda. And I think we got signs of that. Like I tell the behind-the-scenes story of the NDP's experience with the LEAP manifesto, which was this moment when the rank and file, the grassroots membership of the party, voted in favor of that turn, that leftward turn, that Bernie-esque, Corbyn-esque turn. And the establishment of the party freaked out, because I think the establishment of the NDP actually has more in common with the establishment than they do with the majority of Canadians. But we saw a little bit of the kind of fear, or at least reverberations of anxiety among the corporate establishment in this country when you get that kind of anti-establishment left agenda. I tell the story about how just a week after the NDP convention, at the 40th anniversary of the Business Council of Canada, where they were supposed to be celebrating like their success in basically transforming Canada in the interest of corporate interests, Brian Mulroney was like, guys, did you notice what happened at the NDP convention where the LEAP manifesto won? Like, this is serious. Like, all the ideas that I thought I had consigned to the dustbin of history, this is a direct quote, are back. And he's like, this is a philosophy of economic nihilism that must be resisted and defeated. So they get probably better than the progressive movement that this agenda is popular, that those ideas are acceptable again, and that it could be a winning majoritarian program. And I guess the question is just how do we get to that point? And yeah, I think it's going to require social movements getting bigger and noisier and making inroads into the party. But yeah, I think it wouldn't even take much. Like, there's this phenomenon that I describe in the book as the beautiful backlash, which is, when you see that kind of anti-establishment campaign, it always incurs the wrath of the elite, and that usually just engenders even more support. It underlines our anti-establishment bona fide, shows how out of touch the corporate media are from ordinary people's concerns, and energizes the base. There's the story I tell and the thing is the NDP is, because of their class allegiances, are part of it among the kind of professionals who run the party, but they're more worried about censure from the media than they are about like actually building their power. And the attitude of leadership now of some of these insurgent democratic campaigns, like in England, is completely different. Like Jeremy Corbyn in the speech he gave to the convention of the Labour Party after the last election, he described how the day before the election, the Daily Mail, a right-wing paper in England, had published 14 pages, straight pages, just like smearing him and fear-mongering. And he was like, they published 14 pages, and the next day our vote went up by 10%. So I have a bit of advice for the editor of the Daily Mail. Next election, could you make it 28 pages? And that's what I would like to see from the NDP. And we're seeing a little bit more of that kind of stuff, because it's kind of like impossible to ignore its success, certainly in the States with Bernie and with AOC. But I fear that they are taking that turn probably in part because the Green Party is kind of nipping at their heels, as opposed to understanding that that's where the country's at, that's a winning agenda, and that's also what we need to avert climate catastrophe. So, but I think Canadians are hungry for it. So. Yeah.
And the only thing I would add to that, or maybe along those lines, is I think in Europe and in America, what we're also seeing is sort of formations that are outside of parties, but that kind of push parties along, like the DSA and Momentum. So I think that those are kind of crucial institutions. And the other thing is, in some ways, the weaknesses of parties should be a source of optimism. I think it's fairly easy to take over a political party, because it's not like the 1920s or 30s where these are mass institutions that have a lot of people in them. I think
no, the institutions are quite small. It's something I discovered doing that that LEAP manifesto work at the NDP, there were already, when we were, I didn't write about this in the book, but I guess I'll say it now since you were also sharing all kinds of gossip, but there were lots of people from the establishment of the party who sensed that Mulcair was going down, and they were like rats from a fleeing ship. Many people who had not shown an inkling of commitment to those kinds of ideas were joining and helping out the LEAP manifesto win at the convention. And it's true that the establishment itself was quite small. What we discovered is that the social network, we can't really think of the party as just an institution. The social network really closed ranks afterward and put up a bit of a fight. They kind of, seeded damaging narratives about the LEAP manifesto. So I think it would be a fight, but I think it is a winnable fight.
It's doable.
It gets bloody in England. Certainly, like it got quite bloody. I remember talking to Seamus Milne, who's the director of strategy for Corbyn, and he was describing how after Corbyn became leader, he was running the comms department, and 22 of the 25 people under him were trying to sabotage him at every turn. So it will be a fight. Because the iron law of organizations is such that people who run these places are more concerned about the power that they have within than about growing the power of the organization without. So
it's better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven.
Yes. But it needs to happen. And I think we can do it.
I hear a good local step is supplying.
Yes, courage. Yeah, there is a Canadian. There's the beginnings of a Canadian. There's the beginnings of a Canadian style momentum called Courage, which I think is an admirable effort. But I think that the trick is like in the UK, you have to kind of come at it through a pincer movement. Like you have to take the leadership, because these organizations ultimately, these political parties ultimately are so anti-democratic. And I tell some of that story about how we tried to maneuver that to just get the LEAP onto the convention floor at the convention. But you kind of have to go for the leadership, and then that opens up space, as it has in the UK, for the force of social movements to have that like transformative impact. And I think we're starting to hopefully see that in the States as well. I think if Bernie wins the nomination, I think that will create huge openings.
I think that's a note of cautious optimism that we would do well to end. Oh, there's a question. No, it's okay.
What are your thoughts on the current election cycle and recent news events having to do with Trudeau?
Well,
Jeet's been on the radio talking about this.
I've been on the radio talking about this. So I don't think, I don't think the blackface, brownface scandal is going to hurt Trudeau ultimately that much. It might with a few sort of like voters in some of the cities, but I don't think it's going to be kind of significant. I think that Trudeau could get a minority or maybe even like a small majority government. But yeah, you follow this more closely than I do.
No, I agree generally with that. I think that especially if this is a situation where the Conservatives win a minority, right? I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be ready to push for the Greens and the NDP to form an electoral coalition with the Liberals. But certainly make it a point that it would only happen with certain important concessions, like electoral reform. Because I think if we can get that, that opens up huge possibilities for the left in this country as well. Potentially for the formation of new parties to the left of NDP. I mean, I still hold out hope, but maybe it's delusional that the NDP can change. I think it can, but if other people want to try something new, that's exciting too. But I think that will be a key moment. And we kind of had experience with that when in 2008 there was this moment when we could have had a minority government and Harper prorogued and there were a lot of street protests, but I think the left really needs to be ready right after the election to be able to win that, because I think if we get that, we can push for some really major reforms. So
another optimistic note.
Well, thanks God you pulled that one out of the fire, because I was worried for a second. So on that note, I want to thank Martin and Jeet. I think that was the most insightful and entertaining discussion of contemporary politics I can remember attending in person. And we want to make sure there's time for you to buy the book. Have it signed if you so desire. There are books on the back table.
What payment methods are you accepting?
Cash or credit card?
Cash or credit card. Please buy the book, hot off the presses. And again, thank you to Martin and Jeet for coming out and launching this book with us.